Thank you. Thanks so much for coming tonight. I want to especially thank Beth and the people here at St. Mark's for hosting me, as well as Sue and the Progressive Christianity Network, especially Simon Cross. If you know Simon Cross, would you raise your hand? Okay. Simon Cross did a lot of the legwork to make tonight possible. So if you meet him someday, tell him thanks. And it is true that I no longer am an ordained elder in the Church of the Nazarene, nor even a member, thanks to a trial that occurred about 2 weeks ago, and they removed both. That means that I'm a denominational free agent. Or, as some would say it, I'm a nun. I have no religious affiliation. But I'm happy to be with you here tonight. And I know that I have a crazy American accent, so it's my endeavor to speak fairly slowly so you can follow my speaking, and to present to you a set of ideas that I hope will challenge you. I'm the kind of speaker who likes to get big ideas on the floor and then hear your questions. Have you probe me, push me, say, yeah, but what about? So I want lots of time for question and response. Not necessarily question and answer as if I have all the answers, because I'm coming to you with proposals. I don't have the answers straight from God, but I do think these proposals make a lot of sense, fit our deep moral intuitions, match the best in the sciences and arts, and as I like to put it, fits the Bible, at least the good parts. So, my title today is the title of the book that I co-wrote with Tripp Fuller, God After Deconstruction. This word deconstruction may be new to some of you, so let me begin by just really briefly telling you what I mean by it. There are actually many meanings. There's an academic meaning. I'm going to use it more in the popular sense of deconstruction. And that sense is the idea that we no longer can believe ideas that we once believed, especially about religion, God, faith, and we put them aside. We deconstruct them. We either move on to something else or don't move on really anywhere, but we can no longer embrace what we once embraced. For many of us, it was ideas we were taught in Sunday school or church school as when we were younger. For some of us, we actually became ministers in a particular tradition and still decided we had to put away some of the ideas that were given to us. That's what deconstruction is, and it's happening all over the place. In the UK, there's writings and books talking about the deconstruction process amongst Brits and others in this area. In the US, it's a big phenomenon. Social media is filled with groups of people who are deconstructing and asking, what's next? That's what I want to talk about. As Kathy Escobar says in her book that was fairly influential, at least in the States, many people, countless believers, are beginning to experience a slow drift through a dramatic event or otherwise that lands them in what she calls a spiritual wilderness. And this idea that people are in this wilderness, the folks who are there have been called all kinds of clever names. Here are a few: refugees, burnouts, nomads, prodigals, exiles, duns and nuns, the deconverted. That word nomad, I know, is popular here in Britain. There's a pretty famous podcast called Nomad, yeah. I talked with Tim Nash today and had a great conversation. This is a way of trying to capture this phenomenon that so many people are experiencing. Often it comes because of church harm. They're hurt by individuals in a church, or they're hurt by the institution of the church. Sometimes it comes because of big questions that just aren't given good answers. And for the sake of intellectual honesty, they have to say, I just can't believe that anymore. In America, we're seeing a shift that you have experienced here in Britain and in Europe more broadly, away from people who are claiming a particular religious identity. In 2016, 16% of Americans checked the box on Pew Research that said they had no religious affiliation. They were nuns. This year, that 16% has jumped to 28%. If there's roughly, 350 million Americans? That's a lot of people who have gone from once affiliating with a religious tradition to now saying they have no affiliation. And most of those people have a Christian background. Most of those are evangelical or fundamentalist. And they now no longer claim to have any religious identification. But what's interesting, the same poll that says that 28% of Americans are now nuns, which is actually more Americans that identify as Catholic or evangelical, more than 80% of the nuns say they still believe in God. They still believe in a higher power. Most of them aren't quite sure how to frame that, but they have a kind of an intuition that there's a transcendent something. And they're not able to articulate the details, but they're not yet willing to give up belief in this something more, this higher power or God. Kathy Escobar puts it this way in her book. Most people that she interviewed said they never completely severed from God during their radical faith shifts. Now, there are some who become atheists. I don't want to discount those. But one of the reasons I'm emphasizing this idea that so many people who claim to have no religious affiliation still believe in a higher power or God is that tonight I want to do some theology. Tonight I want to talk about a particular way to think about God that may fit some of your intuitions and experiences, but might not fit so well the theology you were taught by somebody in your past. So, this is the overview of what I want to talk about tonight. This is where we're headed. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to identify 8 good reasons people are deconstructing. And these 8 reasons come from various research tools, surveys, polls, some from podcasts and books. Amassed all together, Trip Fuller and I identified 8 good reasons people deconstruct. Now, sometimes in the deconstructive community, the critics from outside will look out at those people who are deconstructing and they'll say, they're walking away from God because they just want to sleep around, or they want to sin. And maybe that's true for some, but the vast majority don't deconstruct willingly, and they don't love it. They find this loss that's deep and profound. So the reasons I'm going to identify tonight for why people are deconstructing, I think are really good reasons. But I'm also going to propose an open and relational theology, or open and relational view of God and the world, that I think actually offers a positive or winsome response to those 8 legitimate reasons people deconstruct. That's where we're headed. Now, because there are 8 of them, and because they're all complex and complicated, there's no way I can dive super deep on every one of them. That means that when it comes time for the question and response, you can ask that question, yeah, but what about? Or let's go deeper here, all right? So, and I should say, these are found in this new book called God After Deconstruction. And I didn't bring any books tonight because I don't like lugging books around on trains. So if it's available on Amazon or other online booksellers if you'd like a copy. So, one of the common themes in all the deconstruction stories that we heard or the surveys done is a loss of certainty. People felt like they had a rock-sure and certain foundation, a rock-solid set of beliefs that they were 100% confident in. And then, for one reason or another, they lost that confidence. They lost the certainty. They unraveled. Those beliefs that they were setting their life upon became unbelievable. And this loss of certainty is a big thing. It's something that philosophers have been exploring for hundreds of years, but it's now becoming much more common in everyday people. Oops, sorry. This particular book I want to especially recommend. Olivia Jackson wrote a book called Uncertain. Olivia works at one of the Durham colleges over there. She interviewed lots of evangelical and fundamentalists, mostly Brits, and this is her bringing together their testimonies to talk about deconstruction from a more British perspective. So you might check out that book. And of course, the title is Uncertain. These people are no longer certain about what they believe. Well, I actually think that the loss of certainty is a good thing. I actually think that people who are rock solid certain are often some of the most difficult people to deal with. I like a little humility in a conversation partner, don't you? Now, when I say it's good that certainty is gone, I'm not saying we're just going to believe absolutely anything. I'm not saying we have to choose between certainty and what I call absolute mystery. I think there's a middle ground between those two. Now, when it comes to mystery, of course, there's always going to be an element of mystery, unless you're a know-it-all, and I don't pretend to be a know-it-all. I'm going to propose to you tonight some ideas about God that I really like, I think are plausible, I recommend to you, and have been literally life-changing for me and countless others. But I'm not certain they're right. I'm not absolutely certain they map onto God in reality. On the other hand, I'm not just pulling something out of my back pocket and throwing it up in the air and say, well, I don't know, it's just absolute mystery. I think our beliefs about the world, ourselves, and even God ought to have some plausibility to them. They ought to match something in our experience or be reasonable. However, it means that we're going to have to live with questions along the way. We're not going to have absolute answers. At least I don't think we can have them. But we'll bring together various sources to try to make a plausible case for our beliefs, one way or another, about God or the world. This is actually a fairly scientific way to go about life. Sometimes we think of science as having all the right answers as if it's absolute certainty, but that's not really the way science works. Science works on hypotheses and theories. Some of them are really good, and we might think they're almost certain, but others are tentative. And I think that's the same way with theology. We don't have to be 100% certain. We can draw from all of these kinds of things, including our own experiences. They're not the only thing that drive us, but they're important. If you come from a religious tradition that has said to you, don't trust your own experience, you're fallen, depraved, and you have nothing good to offer, I'm giving you a different message tonight. You can trust your experiences. Not that they're always right and they're always perfect. You can still make errors, but there is something valuable you bring to the table when you're thinking about God, life, and the world. We can't be certain, therefore, I want to argue, but that doesn't mean we're absolutely clueless. There's a place between certainty and mystery. So, the first reason people deconstruct, they've lost certainty. My answer, you don't need certainty. You can search for plausible ways of thinking about God and the world. Second reason people are deconstructing, a whole bunch of people have been told there is one book that you can be absolutely certain gives you 100% truth, and that book is the Bible. The Bible, in this way of thinking, has absolutely no errors, and because it has no errors and is from God, we can count on it to give us absolute truth. Now, there's some real problems with this, but you can understand the attractiveness of that position, right? I mean, if you wanted something you could just bank on and be sure about, wouldn't that be great? The problem is, I don't think the Bible functions like that, and neither do the vast majority of biblical scholars I know. The Bible can't be that inerrant, infallible, sure and certain foundation of truth, because if you start reading it very closely, you'll find out that there are contradictions, discrepancies, passages that oppose your deep moral intuitions, passages that or views that differ radically from what contemporary science is telling us, and even, and this is the most troubling for me, even contradictory claims about God. You know, it'd be one thing if the Bible was wrong about, let's say, the age of the earth. But when passages present God in some times as wanting us to kill our enemies, and other times saying God wants to forgive our enemies, what do? It would be nice if the Bible was this clear, coherent, inerrant tool, but I just don't think that's what we have. Now, when I was younger, and I would come across these passages that portrayed God in different kinds of ways, I'd read something like, the people of Israel thinking God wanted to bash babies' heads against the rocks, or the people of Israel believing they ought to commit genocide against the Canaanites. I'd look at that and I would say in myself, that just doesn't seem very loving, but maybe from God's perspective, killing everybody is loving. I don't do that anymore. I'm so bold today as to say this. Sometimes the biblical writers just got God wrong. Now, I'm not saying that because I think I'm smarter than everybody else. I'm a 21st century postmodern guy who's got everything figured out. I'm saying that because I think other passages of Scripture oppose the idea that God wants genocide or wants us to bash babies' heads against a rock. And I'm really attracted to this guy named Jesus of Nazareth. And the picture he paints of God isn't a God who wants babies' heads bashed. So while I'm not 100% certain of all this, and although I think the Bible is important, it's not a rock-solid, inerrant foundation for me. Let me say what it is. For me, the Bible is best understood as a collection of writings whose authors sometimes offer great wisdom, but sometimes don't. And I know that's difficult to handle because that means we as individuals, we as communities, we as institutions have to wrestle with these things that seem contradictory, but that just seems like the Bible we have. That sometimes there's incredible wisdom there, and other times not so much. It also means that we can be justified, I think, in believing there is a loving spirit, God, who's wooing or nudging or coaxing us as we engage the Bible. And we may sometimes accurately intuit what that lover calls us to do, think, and feel, and other times just blow it. Not intuitively understand what the Spirit is up to. I mean, that seems like the only obvious, that's too strong. That seems like the most plausible account for how two good-hearted, wise Christians can read the same verse and come to very different conclusions. It's not because one is dumb or one is controlled by Satan. Good people can misunderstand or just not understand Scripture in some way or another. That's just what it means to be finite. So, people are deconstructing because they thought the Bible was inerrant and it was a sure and certain foundation. Then they found out there's good reason to think that's not true. Doesn't mean we have to throw the Bible out. I still read the Bible. I still preach from the Bible. But it does mean that the Bible can't be this capital T true source book that we obviously understand the truth if we just read it. In reality, we have to do some discernment to try to figure out what God might be up to as we read Scripture. All right, third reason people are legitimately deconstructing. In fact, at least according to the polls I've seen, this is the number one reason people deconstruct. The problem of evil. What's that problem? Well, let's put it in question form. If there's a God who's supposedly omnipotent, able to do absolutely anything, at least logically possible, and perfectly loving, loves everyone and everything, why wouldn't this God prevent the genuine evils in our lives and in the world? Notice I use that word prevent. I grew up in a tradition in which people would often say, well, God doesn't cause evil. God allows it. God permits it. But I found that answer so unsatisfying. I mean, do we really think someone's loving who allows evil, that person could stop? I'm coming to you from the great state of Idaho in the United States, and I'm guessing no one in this room has been to Idaho. If you've been to Idaho, oh, yes, whoa, 3 or 4 people have been to Idaho, woohoo! We're way up in the northwest of the state, lots of open land, not many people. Behind my house is a pretty good-sized creek, and I have 3 daughters, and when they were younger in the hot summers, they would go out into the creek, and it was about waist high, and they would play and have fun. Suppose, in an imaginary story, suppose one hot summer day, my 3 daughters are out in the backyard playing in the creek. And suppose my oldest daughter, whose name is Sydney, got so angry at my youngest daughter, Andy, that she took her head, put it under the water, sat on it, and tried to drown her, tried to kill her. Now suppose I'm in the backyard and I'm close enough that I could intervene, get out into the water and grab my youngest and save her. But suppose I said, you know, who am I to interrupt my oldest daughter's free will? I'm just going to let my kids kill each other. Nobody in my little subdivision would vote me Father of the Year. My wife would not understand my moral reasoning. And yet most people I know think God has the ability to prevent horrific evils, but just allows it, permits it. I don't think that makes sense. And that's the number one reason people are deconstructing. It's also the number one thing I hear amongst people who still believe in God. It's their number one question. Tonight, I want to propose an answer. How's that for being bold? No, let me say it more boldly. I want to propose a solution to the problem of evil. My solution is going to be radical to some of you, but probably make a lot of sense to others. What if God loves everyone and everything from quarks to quasars, and that love is inherently uncontrolling? God can't control anyone or anything, from viruses to Putin. God can't control any because God loves everyone. I know, wild idea, big idea. It means that God isn't in control, at least not control in the way most people think of it. In fact, God couldn't be in control in my way of thinking. This is the logic I use. I think God's nature is everlastingly love. And God always, by nature, loves everyone and everything. And I think God's love is always uncontrolling. That means that God can't control anyone or anything because God can't to use the biblical language. God can't deny himself. God can't change God's own nature. If this is true, things change radically. If this is true, oh, by the way, I lay that idea out in a book called God Can't. If this is true, then God is not omnipotent, at least not in the usual ways of thinking about omnipotence. Maybe we want to redefine it pretty radically. And I find that people who are harmed and hurting are the first ones to see the value in getting rid of omnipotence. I get letters practically every week from people who've read God Can't, and they say, finally, a view of God that means that God is not to blame for what happened to me or my sister or my family or whatever. It doesn't mean, however, that God's a do-nothing. This isn't Bette Midler's God who's watching us from a distance. I think God is always active, always working. In fact, the most influential one in the entire universe. This is a strong God. But this God can't control. If this is the way God truly is, then all of a sudden we have an actual solution to the number one reason why people deconstruct, and the number one reason most atheists say they can't believe there's a God. How's that for a big proposal? All right. Number 4 reason people are deconstructing. The church has hurt them. It might be an individual in the church, a Sunday school teacher, a pastor, the church matriarch, whatever. It might be the institution. I don't know how many pastors I talk to who say, I can't believe in God because if God runs a church, I've seen how the church works. And no thank you. They've deconstructed. Many of them will still end up believing in some kind of God, but not the God that they were taught to believe in seminary. The church has harmed so many people. Olivia Jackson, the person I mentioned earlier who wrote the book Uncertain, she puts it this way. People do not deconstruct or leave church lightly. After decades of loyalty and defending church or mission organizations, there's a huge sadness and at times sheer terror about leaving, even if just to a different church. People told me about diagnosed PTSD and years of therapy. Now you might say to yourself, well, of course, the church is filled with people and people make mistakes. Nobody's perfect. And that's true. But so many people have been told that this is a place, this is a community of love and acceptance. And yet it hasn't felt like that at all to them. So they're leaving. So, what's the answer? This is a tough one. I wish I could wave a magic wand and fix every church, and that is not going to be like that. I do think, however, that churches can reinvent themselves, or new churches can start, or communities of people who don't call themselves church can come together in what I call communities of care. It's okay for us to walk away from those faith communities that harm us. Most people do so voluntarily. I, in my own situation, have involuntarily been kicked out. Although, I guess in some sense it was voluntary because I chose to go through the trial and all that. But still, it's okay to walk away from communities that harm us. But that doesn't mean you're walking away from God if God is truly omnipresent. I think God is active and communicating not only in faith communities, but outside of them. I think we all know that God doesn't live in a church building, but sometimes we forget that God can be found everywhere, in all kinds of places, as all creatures, any creature I should say, responds appropriately to God's call for love, justice, zest, creativity, and beauty. God's not confined to the church or Christians. God is active in all kinds of communities of care. This next reason for people deconstructing, I sort of stuck in the church section because most people learn about hell in church. But there's lots of people who took our surveys who said, my first step to deconstruction was deciding that if there was a loving God, there could not be hell, or what scholars would call eternal conscious torment. Eternal, never ending, conscious, we know about it, we feel it, torment. That's the way hell has been described. I want to suggest we should just reject the whole idea. I don't think we need to believe in hell. Now, I do think there are natural negative consequences that come when we harm and hurt one another, that come when we fail to act lovingly toward ourselves, others, and the earth. But that's different than God zapping us, punishing us, or throwing us into the lake of fire for eternity. That idea has so little biblical support, and I think none. But I think even if the passages that seem to suggest that can be easily interpreted in other ways. I want to suggest God never gives up on anyone. An open and relational way of thinking about this God of love rejects hell and says God loves relentlessly. I happen to believe in life after death. I think God loves and invites us to a loving relationship now and beyond bodily death. And God doesn't give up on anybody, ever. Let me pick on my friend Simon in the back. God doesn't say to Simon after Simon's in the afterlife for 3,000 years, you know, Simon, I've given you a gazillion chances. Tomorrow you're off to H-E double toothpick. No, he says, Simon, I'll never give up, calling you to love. And when a God who is literally everlasting never gives up, I think we have hope for universal reconciliation, that love really does ultimately win. Let me jump to the next one. Here I want to pick on Americans because I don't know your context. Maybe some of what I'm about to say applies to you. Maybe it doesn't. I'm just going to pretend like you're an American crowd and I'm going to talk to Americans. And if it fits for you in your context, tell me in the Q&R, all right? Where I live, there's a whole bunch of Christians who are Christian nationalists. They think God likes America better than the UK and any other place in the world. They think that God has chosen us. We're the elect. And God wants us to instill these particular Christian virtues and morals and laws and ways of thinking that don't sound very Christian to me most of the time. They've brought together politics and Christianity in the American context. And of course, Donald Trump is the biggest representation of that, although I don't really think he's much of a Christian. He calls himself one, but lots of Christians follow him and think he is the anointed one. And that has led tons of evangelical young people to say, bye-bye, church. I don't want to be a part of you. You were the ones who told us that this whole Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky sex scandal was showing that Bill Clinton was immoral, and now you're embracing this guy? This makes no sense. There's a really great book written about this from Kristen Kobes-Dumez called Jesus and John Wayne. One portion, she says this: Trump embodied an aggressive, testosterone-driven masculinity that many conservative evangelicals had already come to equate with a God-given authority to lead. Evangelicals did not cast their vote for Trump despite their beliefs, but because of them. The vision I want to propose, and one I think is in line with an open and relational theological vision, says that authoritarianism is never a good thing, especially when it comes to politics. Rather, we should embrace a vision of God not as an overpowering authority, but as a spirit who is nurturing and active everywhere at all times. Not just in one country, not just in one party, but a spirit who loves all creation and nurtures everyone. This, then, is a theological vision that opposes any kind of Christian nationalism, whether or not it's in the U.S. or here or anywhere, because it opposes any kind of attempt to impose by force what one thinks. I think we're up to number 6 now. Science. Some people are deconstructing and walking away because they see conflict between science and religion, science and theology. Usually, it's not that they come to the science book and see it. Usually, it's their faith tradition who says you can't believe the science book and also be a Bible-believing Christian, or whatever kind of label you like. And this, in the past, has been especially true when it comes to evolution. But lots and lots of youth today are saying the church they go to, you can't really embrace science if you're going to be really believe the theology of the church. That's the message they're giving. And when it comes to evolution, this recent book called Baby Dinosaurs on the Ark, Janet Kellogg Ray says, many churches feel comfortable standing against the entire scientific community when it comes to evolution. But I'm seeing today, especially amongst younger people, evolution isn't the hot point. Today, it's two other things: climate change science and how we respond to the pandemic. So many churches of the conservative sort said, pandemic? What? We can't take that seriously. We're going to meet. We're not going to wear masks. God's going to take care of us. And people said, I don't think I want to be a part of that group. Or when it came to climate change, the people in the far right dismissed all the climate science because they said, hey, you can't look at data that says that, let's say 50,000 years ago, the Earth was a different temperature, because the Earth is only 10,000 years old. So we can't take that science seriously. Today, at least in the United States, the evolution question is still important, but it's the questions of climate change and pandemic, or how we react to COVID-19. Those are the ones that are driving many people to deconstruct and walk away from church. I happen to be a fan of a guy named Alfred North Whitehead. He's sort of a philosophical figure in the open and relational theological community, and I love this quote from Whitehead. You cannot shelter theology from science, or science from theology, nor can you shelter either of them from metaphysics, or metaphysics from either of them. Metaphysics is here used in the more academic sense of philosophy, worldview kind of shaping. He says if you really want to make sense of things, you've got to bring all of these things together. And if science seems really strong about the age of the earth, let's say, theology needs to incorporate that rather than trying to reject it. One of the ways I think we do this well is in a view called panentheism. I know it's a view that some of you have heard. If you've heard that word before, would you raise your hand? Panentheism. Okay, maybe a third. Pan is the word for all. Theism is the word for God. En means all is in God. It's different from the word pantheism, which says all is God. This says everything is in God. Or as I put it here, God not only influences you and me and all of creation, but all of creation influences God. God's experience is affected by everything that happens. Or to use language popular in some forms of physics, God is entangled in the world. This idea of God really constituently present in all of reality and us having an effect on God is not the vision of classical Christian theology, in which God is transcendent and unaffected, impassible, all those fancy words. This is a vision of a God who's really engaged in the world, and the world actually influences God. And that has a huge benefit, I think. Think about this a moment. If all of creation influences God, you influence God. Your choices actually matter. The God of the universe is affected by what you do, for good or ill, beautiful or ugly, what promotes well-being or what promotes ill-being. Panentheism says that we then can understand the world in which we live and take hold and claim of the call for reacting to the ecosystems in which we live, protecting them, acting in ways that protect the earth. It means that you and I are co-creators with God. God's not just unilaterally banging stuff out. You and I and others in creation are working with God throughout evolutionary history. That's a big plus, I think. That's typically part of panentheism. All right, number 7, let's talk about sex and gender. Everybody's talking about it these days, so we got to, right? A lot of folks are walking away from the church or walking away from belief in God because they've been told that there are certain things that are true about sexuality and gender. And those true things they're told usually have to do with traditional gender roles, traditional sexualities, and this sexual diversity. People have thought, well, I guess I have to choose. Either I'm going to be who I think I am. Let's say a person thinks they're a lesbian. Either I'm going to be a lesbian and not be a part of the church, or I can be a part of the church and not be a lesbian. Well, I'm a lesbian, so I guess bye-bye church. There's some quotes, I think I'll skip those, but you probably know what's going on there. I think traditional theologies have given us, here I'm going to slip into philosophy for a second, so forgive me if you don't like philosophy, but just for a second, I'm going to talk philosophy. Traditional theologies have been placed on an Aristotelian philosophical framework. How's that for big words? Basically, what that means is that philosophies have said everything has a particular nature. And the human nature has 2 options, female or male. That's it. It has one nature of sexuality, heterosexuality. Only one way to think about attraction, attraction for the opposite sex. Only one way to think about, you just keep going. And these are all about what a person's essence or nature is. Open and relational theology says, this nature stuff. Since Darwin, and since the slow, gradual evolution of species over time, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to think that everything has a particular nature that fits the other things that are kind of like it. And that then frees us up to understand diverse sexualities and genders, to understand why some people are attracted to both males and females, to understand why some people's genitalia don't look like a normal or typical male or female genitalia, etc., etc. Open and relational theologies can embrace these diverse expressions of gender and sexuality because of their ways of thinking about those things. Oops. Looks like I repeated myself here, but it's a nice picture. All right. This is either 7 or 8. This must be 7. If it's 8, then I've got 9 instead of 8. But there's one after this. More and more people today are rubbing shoulders of those of other faith traditions. You know, I grew up in a small farming town in rural Washington State. 5,000 people, lived on a farm. I think we had 5 people of color in my town. Well, I guess 5 black people in my town. There was a pretty large Hispanic population. But I had so little engagement with people who were not Christian. In fact, I didn't think I met someone who I knew was not a Christian until I went to college. Today, my kids can get on the internet and interact with people of all kinds of different religious faiths or no faith at all. Our kids at least have the access to a whole lot more information than I had when I was younger. I'm not saying my kids are always doing searches on religious issues, but they at least potentially have that access. The biggest problem, says my friend Linda Mercadante, and actually she's quoting someone she interviewed, the biggest problem I have with the various religions is that one religion says, if you don't believe what we believe, then you're going to hell. Then another religion says, well, if you don't believe what we believe, then you're going to hell. And I want nothing to do with religion. These exclusivist claims, we've got the right answers, and you guys are damned because you don't believe what we believe. There's another way to think about this. And it recognizes that no one religion has all the wisdom, that the religions of the world can offer different insights into what it means to be God, be the world, and be all kinds of the diverse things that we want to think about in terms of being spiritually mature. We can both embrace the idea that there are multiple religious wisdom traditions and be attracted to one of them more than others. I happen to be attracted to Christianity, but that doesn't mean I can't learn from Buddhists, Muslims. It doesn't mean that I have to condemn all the Hindus to hell. I can be attracted to this guy Jesus and the love he expressed and the particular doctrines that have emerged, at least some of them, in Christian history, and yet also embrace something valuable in other religious traditions. It's okay to be a Christian and also be attracted to other traditions. All right, last one, and then we're going to get to lots of time for Q&R. One of the things that a lot of the people talked about in the surveys about deconstruction is that they no longer thought they had purpose to life. And it seemed like it boiled down to this. They were told by their church that God had a plan for them that was predestined from all eternity. And God had a plan for the whole world. And God knew where things were going. But now, since they can't believe in predestination anymore, they don't think God is, sending people to hell, they don't think God is causing or maybe even allowing evil, then they start to think, yeah, but then what's the purpose for my life? What's the meaning of life in general if God's not controlling it all? I think that's a legitimate question because it functions from the notion that there's a blueprint. There's a particular way God has set up for you. When I used to teach undergraduates at the university, this always came up when it came to marriage. Has God got that one person figured out for you from, before you were born? You were going to marry her or him or whatever. That way of thinking assumes that God has a blueprint with all the details of our lives pre-programmed. I remember one class, I used to teach a class on love at the university, and this one class, this girl who had married the person she thought was going to be the one, and then they got a divorce, she said, did I get off God's blueprint? Right? When things go bad, then does this mean God doesn't love us? There's no purpose for our lives? Is there real meaning? There is a way to think about purpose and meaning from an open and relational perspective. And it begins with persuasion. The God who persuades, who calls rather than controls. Or, since I'm in the UK, and this is where one of my theological heroes is from, John Wesley. John Wesley liked to say, God woos us. I like that. A wooing God. Woo. The God who woos can still have purpose. God doesn't have to have a blueprint, but God has loved, drenched purposes for our lives moment by moment. Could be wrong about this. Could be wrong about what I'm about to say. But I think maybe God's purpose for me at this moment is to do the very best I can giving you this talk. I mean, it's not that spectacular. I'm not picking up, orphans in the streets of Calcutta. But given who I am, and given that you're here, maybe right now, God's loving purpose for me is to do the very best I can to articulate ideas I think could be helpful to you. And maybe God's purpose for you is to listen to me. Again, I could be wrong. Maybe you should be at home watching TV, but maybe you were responding to that wooing of the Spirit to show up tonight in Sheffield, St. Mark's, and listen to this wild guy talk about ideas about God. That's purpose. But it's not a God who's controlling you, saying, oh, you have to go to St. Mark's. That's real purpose in life. That can give our lives meaning. In fact, if we generalize it, maybe our purposes involve things like promoting love, beauty, justice, and positive experiences in all their diversity, which means that your particular purposes can be different from mine, and that's totally okay. And that's beautiful, in fact. It sounds kind of like what the Bible talks about as the body of Christ. Different purposes, but all functioning under love and beauty. Or, instead of thinking of obeying a God with this alleged omnipotence, I think we ought to focus on cooperating with God's love. And here I got to throw another quote from Whitehead up here. Some people study the will of God in order that God may preserve them, says Whitehead. Other people study God's goodness in order to be like God. It's the difference between the enemy you conciliate and the companion you imitate. Ugh. Okay, I got to quote a little Bible. Be imitators of God as dearly beloved children, and live a life of love like Christ loved us. Good stuff. Isn't it a beautiful idea that instead of being afraid that God's going to zap me, that God's going to punish me, that I somehow am going to pay some sort of divine price, either now or through all eternity, if I don't do what God commands, isn't it so much beautiful to say, I want to try to imitate the loving companion of the universe? I like that, at least. So, last slide. A better God, at least I think it's better, maybe you won't like it. A better God after deconstruction is a loving companion who calls us all to an adventure of love, beauty, creativity, justice, and whatever promotes well-being. I'm eager to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. That's given us a lot to chew on, a lot to think about. We've got some time for questions, haven't we? So, yeah, throw it out there. Who would like to ask a question? I'll run around with the mic.
I just met Emily earlier. Thanks for coming.
Been stalking him on the internet for years.
Yes.
My question is, do you think that perhaps it's possible that God didn't plan for Jesus to die?
Say it again.
Do you think that perhaps it's possible that God did not plan for Jesus to die?
Yes. Yeah, the question was, do I think it's possible that God didn't plan that Jesus would die? I not only think it's possible, that's what I believe. I don't think God had it all planned from eternity that Jesus was going to die. Now, I think God could probably anticipate that someone who lived a life of love would meet with great opposition, but that's different from having it all planned out. So, yeah, I think we can talk about Jesus' death and resurrection as being centrally important without having to say, well, God knew it from all eternity it was going to happen.
Hello, I'm Johnny. I've also been stalking you on the internet for quite a few years.
Thanks for coming, Johnny.
I guess, sin is one of the kind of primary doctrines that many of us will have been brought up with. And one of the other cornerstones of Christianity is atonement, the idea that something special happened in Jesus to reconcile human beings to God. What does open and relational theology say about atonement and about making right that relationship with God?
Yeah, great question. I think everybody heard that. Okay. Oh, for sure. The question was, how do I think about sin? And also, how do I think about atonement? Or how does open and relational theology think about atonement? Let me start with the last one and say, there's lots of different ways open and relational thinkers talk about atonement. So I'm not going to try to represent all of them. I'll just kind of talk about my own view here. And then start with your first question. I think sin is still an important category. I still sin. I see other people act in ways that I think are sinful. I don't know their hearts, but it sure seems like it from the outside. I think sin should be understood as choosing other than the love you believe God is calling you to do in any particular moment. So instead of starting with sin and trying to figure out what love is, I start with love and then say sin is the opposite of that. Then the question is, how do we think about atonement? So this is me talking now. I'm not representing the open and relational community. I like to start by saying I don't like any of the classical theories on atonement. So let me talk about some of them first. One idea is that God sent Jesus to pay the price for us, to take our place. And usually that involves somehow God turning away and putting all the sin on the Son and that sort of thing. I don't believe that that's the way God acts. I think that portrays God as unloving. And it portrays God as needing to have somebody die when I think God's a forgiving God. So why do I think God would have to have somebody die in some way? That doesn't make any sense to me. Another theory says that there's a battle between Satan and God. And God tricks Satan by giving him Jesus, and then Jesus comes back alive. And I don't think God's in the business of playing tricks with the devil. That way of thinking doesn't make much sense to me. Most of the major theories of atonement, with the exception of the exemplar theory with Abelard, but most of the major theories of atonement either portray God as unloving in some way, or portray us as kind of passive pawns in a metaphysical chess match. And we just sort of hope that God chooses us. I think we have a measure of free will, not unlimited freedom, but I think we make real choices. And our choices matter to God and the world. So any atonement theory that sort of cuts out our part of the choosing, I'm not going to be attracted to that theory. So if I'm putting together a theory, and I plan to do this, write a book on this someday, I'm going to start with a loving God who doesn't need anybody to die, who's going to forgive everybody their sin because it's God's nature to do so. And I'm going to have agents in the world who make choices for good or bad, and their choices matter. And so God doesn't just up and save them despite their choices, but also God doesn't take away their free will. So we have a God who lovingly, continually calls for us to live a good life, and we have to respond to that call moment by moment. And then Jesus comes not only the great exemplar, like Abelard said, I think that's really important, but his way of life and the community that came after him presents a way of living in the world that we can live into. We can be followers, not just of the Jesus in the past, but of all the saints that came after him that we think are positive. So there's a real role for the church in my atonement theory because, at their best, obviously the church can be bad, but at their best, they're portraying a God of love. So that's not a complete theory, but that's the way I go to start to formulate one.
Hello, I'm John.
Hi, John.
I notice you quote twice from Alfred North Whitehead, and when I was reading, don't want to show off, but when I was reading The Death of Omnipotence and the Birth of Amipotence, I was thinking all the time, here's somebody who's a process theologian without actually acknowledging it. Would you agree with that? Would you think there are parallels, intertwinings between your open and relational theology and the thought systems of process theology?
Yes, definitely parallels. And I studied with some of the great process thinkers like John Cobb and David Ray Griffin and Marjorie Suhaki. But I ended up not calling myself a process thinker and calling myself an open and relational thinker instead, because I found out that there were a variety of process theologies. And when I would go to speak at some place and I would bring up process theology, someone would say, well, process theology doesn't believe in the afterlife. And I would think, well, I do, and so does John Cobb. Or they'd sort of say, they'd have their version of process theology, and it was always something they didn't like. And so I said to myself, okay, maybe the best thing here to do is to talk about open and relational theology as a bigger umbrella under which sits process theologies and open theism and a lot of relational theologies and some feminists and some post-colonials, this sort of big vision, and then in that, hammer out some of my own particular ideas, like amnipotence that you read about. So that's kind of been my strategy. Thanks for your good question. Yes.
Hello. My question is about, so I guess like you talked about how God calls us to love our enemies. And
Was that
how God calls us to love our enemies.
causes us to love our enemies?
Calls us to
Calls us.
love our enemies. And I've noticed in my own kind of journey of deconstruction, moving away very much from that evangelical tradition. And part of that has been having to, reject some of that. And what happens with that is it's very hard to then, it's become my enemy. And I look at like the past of Christian history and how many strains of Christian thinking have been reactionary towards something. Can you look at Protestantism and Catholicism? They've been schisms for years. And I'm not wanting to go down that path into deconstructionism or something being this next schism, but I'm finding myself, it's hard to love your enemy in that circumstance, and I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. That was, he was asking me how I think about loving our enemies, especially in relation to schisms that have happened throughout history, Protestant Catholics, things that are happening today. Is that pretty much it? Yeah. Let me start with the schisms. I think there are always going to be differences of opinion. And unity should not be understood as everybody believing the same thing. If that's Christian unity, I don't believe in Christian unity. I don't think that's ever going to happen. So I think we should expect diversity of opinion, diversity of beliefs. If that's the case, then the question is, what do we do with people who not just don't believe the same as us, but do things that hurt us and act as an enemy? Believe me, I've been thinking a lot about that in recent days, given the trial I went through. But what some of you may not know is that I actually lost my job 9 years ago after going through a theology trial 9 years ago. In that case, I came out the other side not being called a heretic, but the president of my institution, for political reasons, still laid me off. He acted in ways that harmed me and my family and my colleagues and lots of people in the community. And so he acted as an enemy would act, I might say. If enemies harm us, he harmed me. So the question was, what do I do in the face of that? Now, one option is just to say, no big deal. But that's not reality. It was a big deal. It hurt me. If forgiveness means forgetting, there's no way I was doing that. I couldn't forget even if I wanted to. Can't believe how many nights I stayed up until the wee hours of the morning going through conversations in my head saying, I'm going to say this, or I wish I would have said this. But I don't think revenge is the way to go either. So, what does loving your enemies look like? I think it means not taking revenge, but also not pretending like it didn't happen. Trying to act for the well-being of the one who hurt me and the community in light of what happened. And then I learned something that really turned the page for me that I want to share with you. You've probably heard it before, but I lived it. This is what it is. Forgiving those who harm you allows you to move away from bitterness. I know it can be hard, and it may sound kind of selfish, part of the reason I forgive my enemies is for my own well-being. It's for my own benefit. And so now in the situation where I'm in which I've been kicked out of my church, it hurts big time. It hurts big time. But I'm trying to do the things that I think promote well-being, and I'm trying to look at those people who harm me and think, okay, I don't really like them, but I'm going to act in ways that promote their good despite the feelings that are not positive toward them. I think if we have to wait till we have positive feelings for people, then that's probably unlikely, especially in cases of sexual abuse. I'm not ever going to ask a person who's been sexually abused to have warm feelings toward that person's abuser. But I still think there's value in trying to act for their good, which can involve seeking justice and rehabilitation for those who harmed. And I do it in part for my own good. Thanks for your good question.
Thank you. I wonder if what's happening kind of around the world is that we've got tired of this transactional theology, whereby, we've got a problem, God solves it for us, and therefore we read Paul through that kind of lens, or we have done. So the 7 theories of the atonement, the contrast and whatever else. But it seems to me that we need to take seriously the fact that Paul was writing to churches that were in crisis, and they were often in crisis because they were Judaizers in the church that were saying you need to become good Jews first, right, then you'll be better Christians.
That's right.
And so if we read Paul's theories of atonement through that lens, then he's speaking to the Judaizers and saying, it's all covered. And let me give you 7 different analogies. And it's basically saying, get on with living life and stop trying to find or invent this God that's having trouble forgiving you. What do you feel with that? Again,
I'm totally on board with that way of thinking. And it's the way I read Paul as well. Although I have to admit, because of my training, when I read some passages attributed to Paul, I have to think, okay, now what is another way to think about this than the way I've been taught in the past? But I do think that he's writing to an audience, and that audience is used to a transactional system in which you have to do things to appease God or earn God's favor, or at least show that you're amongst the elect. But I think we ought to start with the notion of a God who loves no matter what we do. And if we start there, there's nothing we do that can earn or somehow make God love us more, but what we do can cooperate or not cooperate with that love. And when we do cooperate, we can promote well-being and all the positive things I was talking about. When we don't cooperate, well, I think there are natural negative consequences, not a God who's punishing. Great comments. I like the fact that you get to choose who answers questions. I can seem neutral here.
Thank you very much for that talk. First of all, I wanted to just kind of thank you for what you were saying about the problem of evil. I think that's, I first heard that kind of idea when you were speaking on a podcast. Oh, sorry. When you were speaking on a podcast, and I work as a doctor in one of the hospitals in Sheffield, and my experience of seeing the real suffering of the world really kind of contrasted with my tradition that kind of very much believes in spiritual healing and kind of and that kind of thing. And I think that really helped me in a really difficult kind of place from my faith. So I just want to say thank you, first of all.
Thank you. Can I respond real quickly to
yeah,
that?
of course.
I get notes from people in healthcare, especially therapists, who say, what you say in God can't is what I've been trying to articulate, but just not using theology to do it. So I'm happy to hear that you think similarly.
Yeah. I guess my question is, I feel like, although that's a really helpful kind of framework, you do lose something a little bit in the kind of, there is a comfort in feeling like God is in control. and that God, that kind of Jesus take the wheel, when you're in a situation that just feels too overwhelming. How do you respond to people
Yeah.
in that kind of?
I would respond, that's a real feeling. The question was, first she talked about how she's in a business in which she works with people who are hurt in various ways, and how the book God Can't has been helpful to her as she thinks about God's relation to the troubled people she works with. As a quick summary. But then the question was, I forgot it. The question was, some people find great comfort in thinking that God is in control. And how do I react to that? That people find comfort in a doctrine I don't believe in. And that's exactly the word John Calvin used for predestination. He thought it was a comforting doctrine to believe that God really was in control. And I do think that's comforting when things are going well. When things are not going so well, it's even comforting for some people when things aren't going well. I remember years and years ago when the U.S. was in the Iraq War, I heard a conversation on our public radio in which a guy from a little town in Oregon, the state of Oregon, talked about his son being killed and him having the comfort that God was in control, that it was God. He even used the word predestined on radio, that God had predestined his son to be killed in Iraq. That does not comfort me, but I have to admit that some people find it comforting. And to those people, I just say, well, if that works for you, great. I know a lot of people for whom it works for a while and then it doesn't. So please at least be open to what I'm proposing, because that may be down the road. You might like it. But I'm not usually going to try to talk somebody out of something that they find great comfort in, unless it's hurting lots of other people.
How can we help Catholics and evangelicals with their problems of sex and gender?
I've been asking myself that. The question was, how can we help Catholics, I assume you mean conservative Catholics and evangelicals, with questions of sexuality and gender? Let me share a few things. That these aren't going to be slam dunk answers, but these are things that I found to be helpful. For me, as a former evangelical, the first place I wanted to look to answer a question like this was the Bible. And there are 6 to 8 passages that seem to relate to, in the old days we just said homosexuality, but today we say queer issues, LGBTQIA+, all that. So for me, I went to the Bible, I looked at these passages, and then I said, well, let's see what the scholars have to say. So I went to the library, and it turned out that the scholars didn't have the same interpretation of those passages as I had or the people who taught me had. And I thought to myself, okay, so there's some really smart people who know the Bible better than I do, and better than my pastor and my Sunday school teachers did, who read this same passage and either say it doesn't apply to, again, in those days we called it homosexuality as we understand it, or we don't need to follow it because it portrays a bias or a prejudice or a way of thinking in its time, like so much patriarchy in Scripture. So then I thought, okay, well, if really smart people don't interpret these passages in the way that I had been led to, what principle should I use when coming to Scripture to try to make sense of it? I want to read the best of scholarship, and scholars don't all agree. But on some things there's a consensus. So, for instance, why is it that in Leviticus, I think we should take seriously, thou shalt not kill, but I don't think we have to take seriously a man should not lie with a man? What's the interpretive rule that I'm going to use to make sense of that? Why do I prefer one over the other? Or why is it that I am in front of you tonight wearing clothing made of more than one fabric, and that's expressly forbidden in Leviticus? Why don't I lose sleep over that? Where I might lose sleep over a man lying with a man or whatever. That then led me to a principle that's common in several traditions, but especially the Wesleyan tradition or Methodist tradition that I was from. And that is the rule that we should try to interpret Scripture using love as our guide, the hermeneutic of love. And that meant asking the question, how do we think about these that would promote love? That helped me with the biblical passages, and I think it can help some conservative Catholics and evangelicals. But I've found in my experience that is not the most effective thing. The Bible's important. I still read it. I still read biblical scholars. But very few people I know change their mind on queer issues by reading biblical scholars. Sorry, all my Bible scholar friends who are listening to this. I think they know it. So how do people change their minds? Well, another way is then to ask what love is about. If love is my hermeneutic, love is my interpretive lens, then what is love? I've done a lot of work on that. My wife likes to kid me that most of my book titles have the word love in them somewhere. She says, when are you going to get sick of talking about love? I think love is fundamentally about promoting well-being, flourishing, what Jesus called abundant life, what the Jewish scriptures call shalom, or blessedness, what the philosophers called eudaimonia, the goodness of life. And so when it comes to queer people, I then have to ask, can queer relationships be good? Can they promote flourishing? The overwhelming scientific consensus says yes, that queer relationships can be healthy. Not all of them are, just like not all straight relationships are healthy, right? But they can be healthy. And then to add to that, I happen to know queer people in healthy relationships, so I have anecdotal evidence that supports the scientific consensus. I think that moves a lot of people closer to being affirming. But the thing that is the most effective, I've seen it over and over, is not making arguments from the Bible, not showing about how science says that queer relationships can be healthy. It's having an actual friendship with a queer person that makes the biggest difference. Your son or your daughter or your sister or your brother or the kid you grew up with comes out and you say, whoa, I got to rethink what I think about queer issues because I know that person and she, he, or they are positive and they're doing what they think is best. That's the number one thing that makes people change their minds. That presents a problem then, because I happen to be a straight, cisgender, white guy. And so, I can't be the gay representative to the world to say that gay people are great, or queer people are great. That kind of puts a little bit of the responsibility on queer people, but that doesn't seem fair at all. Why should they have to carry the load to show that they can have healthy relationships? I don't think some of them should feel like they have to carry that load. I think we all need to carry it. But the truth is, most people I know change their mind not because somebody like me gave them a good argument, because someone they know came out of the closet. That's...
You spoke about us influencing God. Well, usually when you influence somebody, you see a change or you have a conversation in which, so where does our influence go? What becomes of that influence and what becomes of the nature of God because we respond in influence?
Yeah, great question. She was asking about influence and divine influence. What becomes of that? And then you even ended by saying what happens to the nature of God because of that influence. Let me start with a technical thing that I think makes a real difference. I want to distinguish between God's nature and God's experience. I think God's nature is unchanging. It's always going to be loving. It never has changed. But I think God's experience changes moment by moment. God's influence makes an effect on us, and our response has a real effect on God's experience moment by moment. But I think part of your question is, what happens to that influence, right? Like, how do we see that in the world? Is that kind of, yeah. I think we see divine influence wherever we see something that's positive, that is valuable, that promotes well-being, that's beautiful, that's lovely, that's excellent, that works for justice. I think everything we value as positive in the world has God as its source and creaturely contributions to make it a reality. Everything we think is evil, I think God tried to bring something good there, but creatures either didn't cooperate or the conditions of creation were not conducive for something good to come out of it. So I think your question is kind of a question of divine action. How do we see what God's up to in the world? And I don't think you can see God. I don't think you can look out on the sidewalk and see God walking by with an umbrella. I think God's an invisible, universal spirit. I do, however, think that when creatures act in some kind of positive way, I believe God was influencing them toward that positive way, and we can say that God was acting and creatures were responding appropriately. Does that help? It doesn't. Oh, no! You want to try again, or?
Okay, so you said God influences us, but if I've influenced God
Yes.
and therefore influenced this experience that God has,
Yes.
how is that then reflected back in our world?
Oh, okay, yes. That's a more difficult one. I'm speculating that our influence affects God based on my assumption that God's a relational being. It's not something I can prove very easily. But I sort of start with the notion that God is loving. And it seems like loving is not only giving, but also receiving. It seems like love has an empathetic element to it. The biblical writers talk about God having compassion. Well, since I think God is an invisible spirit, I can't see that happening. But I'm assuming that God's the kind of being, because God is loving, that God has that kind of empathy and compassion. Thanks.
Okay, I think this is going to be the last question. So
Better be good. No pressure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm a Derridean theologian. So one of the key sort of things I'm thinking about when you talk about deconstruction is deconstruction theory and practice. And so my question is, what if it did, what sort of role and influence that maybe deconstruction theory and Derrida might have had on your journey here?
Yes. That question was about the philosopher Jacques Derrida. He's the one who made the word deconstruction famous, first in academic circles and then only later in a more popular sense, like I've talked about tonight. For Derrida, it wasn't deconstructing so much about belief in God, although he did talk a lot about God. It was more about the inability of words to capture fully reality, capture truth fully. And once you start thinking about that, not only does your word God not capture God fully or truly, but even your word pew or ground or hair, none of your language can capture the truth of the thing absolutely and fully. And if you think that language gives you absolute truth, then deconstruction just pulls the rug right out from underneath you. Now, as a theologian and someone who read the Bible, I had already given up inerrancy. So I didn't think the Bible, give me inerrant truth. But I wanted some of the Bible to have something that was 100% true. I wanted God is love. That's like the most important thing to me. And what Derrida did was pull out for me the possibility that that 3-word sentence could provide the full truth about who God is. And for a while, that was really difficult. That was my second deconstruction, actually. My first one was back in college. Anyway, I won't go there. So then my question was, okay, what do I do then? If language can't give me the full truth, not only about reality, but any single thing in reality, then how can I have any confidence that my language is making truth claims about the world? The key for me, here I'm going to go nerdy since you asked me a nerdy question. The key for me was beginning to believe that experience was more fundamental than language. That there's a pre-linguistic element that's more fundamental than what I can say with my words. And as I thought about that, it seemed pretty obvious. Birds communicate, but they don't have words like I do. There's lots of things going on in the world experientially that words not only can't capture, but they don't even involved in. And here, again, Whitehead was helpful to me by giving me a metaphysical assumption. We're ending in a really esoteric way. Maybe we ought to have one other question. Can we do that? Let me finish this and let me... So it was that pre-linguistic notion of experience as being more fundamental, what William James called the drops of experience that make up reality. That was the thing that helped me move past the correct Derridian deconstruction that hit me in graduate school. Can we go to him last?
We'll do one final one then.
No offense, but I hate to end with Derrida.
I wanted to ask you about a hypothetical bus journey.
Hypothetical what?
Bus journey.
Bus journey, okay.
So at one end, you've got this belief in an all-controlling, vindictive God.
Yep.
At the other extreme, you've got a belief that says God is completely uncontrolling, almost uninfluential.
Oh.
So along that bus journey, perhaps there are other stops that you could get off at. For example, you said that God doesn't punish, maybe he disciplines. So to use the example of your daughter, you said if I loved my daughter, I would prevent her from murdering her sister. But maybe you would be willing to discipline your daughter out of love. So does God discipline, even though he doesn't punish?
I want to answer that in two ways. First, to talk about discipline, and second, to see if Beth will dance with me, all right? So let me start with discipline. When I think about discipline that I might do with my child, it almost always involves some sort of physical activity, putting her in timeout, let's say. Or in the case you mentioned, taking her off the head of my other daughter so they don't drown. Because, like most theists, I think God is incorporeal and doesn't have a localized divine body. God doesn't literally have a hand to swat a kid in the butt or to throw a lightning strike on you. So that's how I handle that good discipline question. But the other thing was, you talked about a spectrum between a God who is controlling and a God who is a do-nothing God. And here, if you don't mind dancing with me, I want to talk about 3 ways of thinking about God to close tonight. And to do that, Beth is going to represent you all, or just a person, an individual.
Making me feel quite nervous.
And if you don't mind, Beth, would you go over by those 2 gentlemen and stand? So she's going to represent the world, creation, creatures, humans, whatever. And I'm going to represent God. Now, this is a dance floor. Now, in the United States at least, when I was in high school, after the football game, we'd all go in the cafeteria, the music would play, and usually the girls were on one side and the guys were on the other side, and usually the couples who were dating would start dancing first, but the guy would walk over and ask the girl to dance. So the first model of God is at the far end of the spectrum where God is in control. And God comes all the way across the floor and says, Beth, you will dance with me. And she has no freedom, no control. I take control. She does whatever I think because I'm controlling her. Can you go back to that side? That's the first model. I'm against that model, and I think you are too. Here's the second model. God's on this side, creatures on this side, and God's thinking, well, if you take a step toward me, I'll take a step toward you. Why don't you do that? Okay, if you work really hard, and if you're really good, and take another step toward me, I'll take a step toward you. Okay, you can see how this is developing. Basically, if she works hard enough, if she gets her act together, if she lives a perfect life, a life of love, well, then I'll meet her halfway. I don't believe in that God either. Let's go back. This is the God I believe in. And I think it fits somewhere closer. It's the uncontrolling God, but it's not a do-nothing God. This God comes all the way over to us, prevenient grace, comes all the way over to us, but says, may I have this dance? And she has the freedom to accept or reject. And just for the sake of the argument, accept. And once we begin dancing, she doesn't lose her freedom. She can go join the mosh pit if she wants to, or she can dance cooperatively with me. And if she does, it's a beautiful dance. If she goes to the mosh pit, it gets ugly. But she doesn't lose her free will.
Depending on your taste.
That's true, that's true. But the point is, we have an uncontrolling God throughout, but not a do-nothing God. Not a God who we have to earn that action. God's always acting, but always inviting. Thanks so much for listening to my wild ideas.
Thanks. Thanks so much for coming and being with us this evening. You're doing a whole tour of different talks, and it's just been great that you've been able to come to Sheffield. So thank you. Thank you so much. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been a good evening as well. At St Mark's, we try and hold events like these regularly. So if this is the first time you've been to St Mark's and you'd be interested in coming to another talk, do stay connected to us through our socials. We do also send an email out once a term. So if you want to be added to that mailing list to find out about events like these, there's a bit of paper next to the tea and coffee at the back. Do pop your email on that and we'll let you know once a term about what's coming up. But let's thank Tom again for his input this evening.